It was supposed to be another ordinary night in the small red brick house where the neighborhood silence was usually interrupted only by the sound of crickets and the rustling of trees in the wind. But on this particular night, something different was in the air, something that only Ethan Johnson, a 12-year-old black boy, seemed to notice. While his mother washed the dishes and the rest of the house fell asleep, Ethan lay awake, uneasy with the strange sensation coming from the back. Bedroom, the old room where they kept old things and where no one had entered for weeks. It was there, among dusty boxes and forgotten toys, that he heard the first whispers. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't plumbing. They were voices, low and distressed, coming from behind the cabinet against the wall. Most children would have been startled and run, but Ethan, his eyes wide and his heart racing, decided to listen a little longer before taking action. And when the third night brought the same whispers, clearer, more anguished, he knew he could no longer remain silent. Without telling anyone, he picked up the phone and called the police. What officers discovered when they pushed that cabinet and broke through the wall behind it shocked the entire neighborhood and revealed something that had long been needed to be exposed. But what exactly was hidden there? Who were the voices crying for help? And why didn't anyone else listen? Except Ethan. If you believe that courage can be born in silence and that a child's instinct deserves to be heard, like this now and subscribe to the channel, because this story will shake your view of everything that seems too calm to be real. Ethan Johnson wasn't a boy who drew attention wherever he went. At 12, his presence was almost invisible, as if the world had grown accustomed to looking over his head without truly seeing him. He had dark skin, attentive, deep-set eyes that seemed to hold more questions than answers, and a silent walk. Always hunching his shoulders, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. Many neighbors barely remembered his name, and at school he was known only as the quiet kid in the back of the class, the one who didn't talk much and seemed to live in his own world. After his mother began working double shifts as a hospital assistant, Ethan moved in with his Aunt Monica, a strict woman scarred by years of struggle, who believed more in discipline than imagination. Monica offered him shelter, food and a bed, but she couldn't understand her nephew's sensitivity. She believed life was too hard for a boy to indulge in dreams or make up stories. So when Ethan talked about details he noticed on the street, strange noises or suspicious gestures from neighbors, Monica would just shake her head and say, "You need to stop paying attention to those things, kid. People who get involved too much always get into trouble." At school, the situation was no different. Ethan loved to observe, but rarely participated. While his classmates enjoyed themselves during recess, he sat off to the side, jotting down small details in a worn notebook. The way a teacher seemed overly nervous on the phone, the backpack forgotten in the hallway that moved unnoticed, the forced smile of a student hiding something. But none of this was taken seriously. When he tried to share, the children laughed and the adults responded with dry remarks, as if they were merely tolerating the fertile imagination of a boy who should have been paying attention to his math homework. Despite this, Ethan possessed a quiet gift, the ability to sense what others missed. He didn't need elaborate explanations to suspect something was amiss. A look, a sound, an untimely pause was all it took. This sensitivity made him different but also lonely, because no one seemed willing to believe anything that couldn't be seen or proven immediately. The world treated him like an ordinary boy, when in reality he carried within him a quiet courage ready to awaken at the right moment. In that room of his aunt's house, with the closet pushed against the old wall, Ethan felt like something was finally too big to ignore. The whisper he'd heard wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, urgent, and painful. Even so, he hesitated to speak again, because he already knew the answer. Disbelief, rebuke, maybe even punishment. Being invisible hurt, but being disbelieved hurt even more. Ethan wasn't sure what to do. He only knew he was alone, facing a secret that could change everything. His eyes, fixed on the closet, seemed hypnotized by the idea that there was someone on the other side, someone waiting for him to summon the courage to act. He wondered if he could bear the burden, because each day the whisper seemed louder, as if the wall were growing thinner. And it was in this silence filled with doubt that the first difficult decision of his life arose. Should he or should he not tell what he had heard? The answer seemed obvious, but deep down he already feared what would happen if he dared to open his mouth. And like any secret kept for too long, the time would soon come when Ethan would have to risk speaking, even if no one believed a single word. The first night, Ethan thought it might just be a trick of his tired ears. The second, he tried to convince himself it could be the wind coming through some crack in the wall. But it was on the third night that everything changed. The digital clock beside the bed read just after 2 in the morning, when the room fell into such absolute silence that even the crickets outside seemed to fall silent. It was at that moment that the whisper returned, more insistent, closer, as if someone were pleading behind the wood. "Help me! I'm here!" This time, there was no mistaking it. The tone was all too human, filled with pain and despair, unlike any echo that might emerge in an old house. Ethan sat up in bed, his heart pounding, his breath quickening, and let his eyes roam every corner of the dark room until they settled on the cabinet against the wall. The piece of furniture seemed so ordinary during the day, but at night it transformed into an oppressive shadow, as if hiding unreachable secrets behind its closed doors. With trembling hands, he pulled the blanket up to his chin, but something inside him, that same sensitivity that had so often been mocked, urged him to stand. He approached slowly, his bare feet squeaking on the floor, and stopped in front of the closet. He pressed his ear to the cool wood and for a few seconds heard nothing but the sound of his own heart, until suddenly his voice returned clearer, forming broken words. "I can't get out." A shiver ran through his body. He took a few steps back, swallowing hard, his mind whirling with unanswered questions. Who was there? How could someone be behind a solid wall? And most of all, why hadn't anyone else noticed? Fear tried to overwhelm him, but with it came the certainty that something terrible was happening inside that house. Ethan returned to bed, unable to close his eyes for the rest of the night. With every creak of the wood, every shifting shadow, he wondered if he was missing the chance to save someone who depended solely on him. In the morning, when sunlight flooded the room, the cabinet once again seemed like an old piece of furniture, heavy and lifeless. But Ethan knew what he'd heard hadn't been a dream. It was real. And, like every royal secret, sooner or later it would have to be revealed. The next morning, Ethan came down to the kitchen, his eyes tired, the dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. He sat at the time-scratched wooden table and absently stirred his cereal, not daring to look at Aunt Monica. But the weight of what he'd heard during the early hours was too great to bear alone. He took a deep breath and, in a low, almost hesitant voice, released the words that seemed to burn his throat. "Aunt, there's someone talking inside my room." Monica looked up from her newspaper, arched her eyebrow, and let out a short, impatient laugh. "Boy, don't start with those stories. It's just your imagination. You need to get some sleep instead of making things up." Ethan tried to insist, describing the phrases, the tone of desperation, the cold he felt as he approached the closet. But the more he spoke, the more he felt his aunt's stern gaze turning into a reprimand. "That's enough," she said, slamming the newspaper against the table. "If I hear you repeating that nonsense, you'll be grounded." The boy fell silent, swallowing back the tears that insisted on welling up. A feeling of invisibility tightened his chest, as if the entire world were determined to ignore what he knew to be true. At school, he considered staying silent, but the anguish was so great that he decided to risk it again. During science class, he waited until the end to approach the teacher. "Mrs. Davis, I think someone's trapped in my aunt's house. I heard voices," he said, his eyes fixed on the ground. The teacher sighed, adjusting her glasses, and responded in a condescending tone. "Ethan, you have a lot of imagination. Maybe you're reading too much or watching horror movies. Go play at recess and forget about it." Two colleagues who were nearby heard the conversation and started laughing. "Ethan talks to ghosts," one of them scoffed, the joke spreading throughout the room in seconds. The shame was overwhelming. Ethan retreated to his usual corner, hugging his notebook to his chest, trying to hide from the laughter and whispers. This hurt more than any physical punishment. It wasn't just the fact that they didn't believe him. It was the knowledge that, even if he screamed at the top of his lungs, no one would listen. That night, lying in bed, the room fell silent again. Ethan closed his eyes, wishing it were just a nightmare. But when the clock struck the same time as the morning, the whisper returned, filled with urgency and desperation. He felt his body shiver, because now there was no doubt. Someone was there. And if no one believed him, he would have to find out for himself. After being ridiculed at school and reprimanded by his aunt, Ethan realized he could no longer rely on anyone. The responsibility he carried was too great for a 12-year-old boy, but he saw no other way out. If no one believed him, then he would have to find a way to prove he wasn't making things up. It was risky, but his quiet courage spoke louder than his fear. The next night he lay awake, pretending to sleep. He left his notebook hidden under his pillow, and as soon as the first whispers began to echo again, he got up slowly, careful not to let the creaking floorboards betray his footsteps. He approached the closet and, this time, took a pen with him. Every word he heard, he scribbled down quickly, even as he trembled with anxiety. He jotted down phrases like, "I can't get out," "He will come back," "It helps me." That was no longer just any murmur. They were cries for help, pieces of a story suffocated by the walls. With his aunt's cell phone in hand, which he had taken secretly, he tried to record the audio. He stood motionless for several minutes until he managed to capture a section in which a female voice, almost muffled, repeated insistently, "I am here." He played the song over and over, headphones on, his heart racing. With each repetition, he became more certain it wasn't his imagination. It was real. Over the next few days, Ethan turned his nights into small covert operations. Pretending to go to bed early, he would get up when everyone was quiet and investigate the closet. He would tap lightly on the wood, trying to identify any hollow spots. He would put his ear close, probing every crevice as if he could find a hidden opening. Sometimes he thought he heard answering knocks, as if someone on the other side were trying to communicate. The feeling of closeness gave him chills. One of those nights, the whisper brought a new phrase, "He's going to hurt me again." Ethan froze. This wasn't just someone trapped. This was someone in constant danger, someone whose life was at risk. The boy felt his stomach churn, but at the same time, a flame of courage ignited within him. If he waited any longer, it might be too late. During the day, he continued his role as the invisible boy. He kept his audio recordings and notes under his mattress and hid his cell phone to avoid arousing suspicion. He observed every detail of the house, the neighbors' strange movements, any clue that might help piece together the puzzle. He began to realize that the secret wasn't just in his room. There was a shadow hanging over the entire neighborhood, as if everyone were blind to the danger. At one point, he risked pulling the cabinet a few inches to the side, but the piece was too heavy for his strength. Even so, he could hear a distinct creaking sound coming from the wall. It was as if there were a hidden space, a hidden compartment, and this only reinforced his conviction that someone was trapped there. The fear didn't disappear, but it was swallowed by the urgency to act. Ethan no longer wondered if he was imagining things. Now he wanted answers. With each new note, each recording, the certainty grew within him that he would soon have to make a decision far greater than any child should ever face. And when he finally heard a sentence that would change, "Everything, he'll be back tomorrow," the boy realized that his secret investigation was reaching a point of no return. What until then had seemed merely a suspicion was taking on darker overtones of immediate danger. The next morning, Ethan was no longer trembling with fear alone, but with a confusing mix of anticipation and anguish. He had prepared himself like a silent detective, leaving his cell phone charged and his notebook open beside his bed. He knew the whispers would come, and this time he was willing to hear every word, no matter the cost. The clock ticked slowly forward until the hand reached 2 in the morning. Then, as if in some macabre ritual, the voice returned. At first it was a muffled murmur, difficult to distinguish, but soon it became clearer, more intense, filled with despair. The woman said between sobs, "He's coming back tomorrow. I can't bear it." Ethan froze. He felt a lump in his throat, his stomach tighten, as if with every word the pain penetrated the walls and reached his very body. There was no longer any room for doubt. Someone was trapped there, someone suffering in the shadows, completely invisible to the world. With sweaty hands, he discreetly turned on the recording on his phone and approached the closet, pressing his ear against the cold wood. The woman's breathing was audible, ragged, a fragile cry that seemed lost in the void. It was impossible to ignore. He closed his eyes, fighting the urge to cry along, and realized that suddenly the entire room seemed smaller, suffocating, as if carrying the weight of the pain hidden behind that wall. Ethan knew he could no longer treat this as a mere mystery. It wasn't just a curious secret he could keep silent. It was a crime, happening right before his eyes, real human suffering. With every passing second, the woman grew weaker, and the threat that he would return the next day triggered an urgent alarm within him. Filled with quiet courage, Ethan swore to himself that he would do something. He sat up in bed, opened his notebook, and wrote in shaky letters, "There's someone trapped behind the closet. I need to save this person before it's too late." It was as if writing those words down was a pact, a commitment to his own conscience. He could never go back on it. Fear still gripped him, but it was accompanied by a strange sense of responsibility. He was no longer just an invisible boy. Now he was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who could act. The sound of his aunt's footsteps sleeping in the next room reminded him that he couldn't count on any adult. The weight of that loneliness crushed him, but at the same time it gave him clarity. If it weren't for him, no one would ever hear those stifled screams. And so, between fear and courage, Ethan realized there was no more time. That voice was delivering not only a cry for help, but also a deadline. And that deadline would be up in a few hours. The sun had barely set when Ethan noticed something strange. In the air, the usually quiet street seemed filled with a strange silence, as if even the neighbors knew, without understanding why, that something dangerous was lurking nearby. From his room, peering through the small window, the boy saw the silhouette of a man walking slowly down the sidewalk. His posture was heavy, his steps too firm, and even from a distance, Ethan felt goosebumps rise. He needed no explanation. It was him. The kidnapper had returned. The boy's heart raced, each beat echoing. Inside his head, he hid behind the curtain, his eyes fixed on the figure approaching the house. The man glanced around, as if checking he wasn't being followed. He wore a dark coat, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and every movement conveyed menace. Ethan didn't recognize that face, but instinct told him it was someone very dangerous. The sound of keys being forced into the door made his stomach churn. He held his breath, afraid any noise would betray his presence. The slow creak of the door opening echoed down the hallway, and the boy heard heavy footsteps entering the house. Each creak of the wood felt like thunder in his ears. He cowered in the corner of the room, his entire body trembling, but he didn't dare run away. Then, from the other side of the closet, the woman's voice came back, even lower and more muffled. "He's here!" Ethan closed his eyes, feeling her anguish mix with his own. He wanted to scream, run, call for help, but he knew that if he did, he would ruin everything. He needed to think. He needed to wait. The man paced the house as if checking a hiding place that already belonged to him. Ethan heard the sound of something being dragged. Perhaps a chair, perhaps the closet itself. The sensation that the villain was mere inches away nearly made him lose control. But it was in that moment that the boy discovered the strength of his silent courage. Even with fear corroding every fiber of his body, he decided to remain steadfast, watching and waiting for his chance to act. In his pocket, his aunt's cell phone seemed heavier than ever. It was his only weapon. One piece of evidence captured at the right moment could change everything. He didn't know how, but he felt he needed to record that presence, that return, so that no one could ever again ignore his truth. And it was precisely this decision that transformed the silence of the night into a prelude to revelation. Ethan was about to risk everything to prove he wasn't alone in this fight. Ethan remained motionless, his heart pounding so loudly it seemed to betray his presence. The man's footsteps echoed through the house, each one heavier than the last, until he stopped in front of the closet. The boy felt his blood run cold. There was only a thin wall separating him from the kidnapper and the victim. Then he heard the sound of something metallic hitting the wood, as if the man were checking the padlock or reinforcing some kind of invisible lock. It was at that moment that Ethan summoned courage. With his phone hidden between his hands, he activated voice recording and remained completely silent, praying that none of his noise would be captured. The villain began to mutter, speaking softly, but his words were sharp, laced with menace. "You won't scream. No one will ever hear you. I'll come back tomorrow, and then we'll see if you've learned your lesson." Each syllable registered on the device seemed to weigh a ton. This wasn't just a victim's desperate whisper. It was a criminal's clear confession. Ethan clutched the phone to his chest as if holding a piece of gold. For the first time, he was no longer alone in his truth. Now he had proof. The woman on the other side was crying softly, the sound of her labored breathing piercing the wood like invisible stabs. Ethan closed his eyes, fighting the urge to help immediately, but he knew he couldn't act impulsively. He needed to think like someone much older than he actually was. When the kidnapper's footsteps finally receded and the front door slammed shut, the boy released the breath he'd been holding for minutes. His entire body trembled, but within him was a spark of relief. He'd found the missing piece, the detail that could turn the tide. Clutching his cell phone tightly, he lay in bed, unable to fall asleep. The recording pulsed in his hands like a powerful secret. Now he had something no one could refute, something capable of turning disbelief into action. But even with the proof in hand, one question kept hammering at his mind. Who would believe him enough to act before it was too late? The clock ticked slowly, each minute feeling like a burden too heavy for a 12-year-old boy to bear. Ethan knew he couldn't wait any longer. With the test in hand, his cell phone hidden under his pillow, he took a deep breath and made the boldest decision of his life. He picked up the phone, dialed 911 with trembling fingers, and put the phone to his ear, his heart nearly bursting in his chest. "Emergency, what's your problem?" The dispatcher's voice sounded firm but distant. Ethan swallowed hard and answered softly, almost whispering so as not to wake his aunt in the next room. "There's a woman trapped in my aunt's house, behind the closet in my room. Please come quickly." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a warning tone. The operator asked for details, his address, his name. The boy answered what he knew, trying to remain calm, and before hanging up, he added, "I have recordings. He came back today. He said he'll come back tomorrow." Half an hour later, sirens shattered the neighborhood's silence. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows, waking residents who rushed out to their doors to see what was happening. The sound of police cars pulling up in front of the house made Monica jump up, startled, and run down the hallway, completely confused. Ethan, motionless, waited for the inevitable. The door was broken down, and police officers entered with flashlights in hand. Ethan led the way, pointing to the closet, his voice shaky but firm. "It's here. This is where she is." For a moment, no one really believed it. The officers looked at Monica, who looked as confused as all the neighbors gathered on the street. But as the officers dragged the heavy cabinet and struck the wall with sledgehammers, the sound of cracking wood and concrete revealed what was hidden. Behind the false wall, in a narrow, suffocating space, lay Angela Moore. Her hair disheveled, her face pale, her wrists marked by ropes. She wept silently, but upon seeing the flashlight's light, she looked up as if she had just been resurrected. The neighborhood watched in shock as the police freed her, carrying her out of the house in their arms. The murmur of the crowd turned to shouts of surprise, questions, and cell phone flashes. Everyone wondered how it was possible, how no one had noticed. Ethan, standing beside his aunt, simply watched. A mixture of relief and disbelief filled him. He had done what no one had believed was real, but as the street filled with journalists and curious neighbors, the question still lingered. Who would discover that the true hero of that night was only 12 years old? As neighbors crowded the sidewalk, trying to understand what had just happened, Ethan remained silent, half hidden behind his aunt. The police, busy with the victim and the search for the kidnapper, didn't immediately pay attention to the boy. But one detail began to stand out. How did that child know exactly where to look? One of the officers approached Monica, still stunned by all the commotion. "Ma'am, who made the 911 call?" he asked firmly. Monica hesitated for a few seconds, then her eyes fell on her nephew. Ethan, shy, lowered his head, clutching his cell phone to his body. His aunt took a deep breath and replied, almost incredulous, "It was him. My nephew." The police officer turned to the boy with a look of surprise and respect. "You saved a life today, kid." Ethan didn't know how to react. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just shook his head, his eyes watering, as if to say he hadn't done it for recognition, but because he couldn't bear to hear a voice fading away in the darkness. Some reporters tried to approach, microphones in hand, but he backed away, hiding even further behind his aunt. He didn't want flashbulbs or headlines. His victory was silent, just as his courage had always been. The neighborhood, which had so often ignored him, now watched him with a mixture of surprise and respect. But for Ethan, none of that mattered. What really mattered was that the woman was alive, that the whisper behind the closet had turned into a scream, heard by everyone. Still, a question hung in the air, a reflection that no one dared to verbalize. How many other voices, invisible like his, still remained suffocated by silence? Ethan's case wasn't just the story of a boy who heard what no one wanted to believe. It was a cruel, in portrait of how society insists on silencing voices it deems too small to be heard. His entire life he had been ignored, invisible not only because he was a child, but also because he was black, carrying on his shoulders the weight of prejudices the world prefers to pretend don't exist. And yet, it was precisely this invisibility that gave him the chance to perceive what others didn't. While adults were too busy with their routines and disbelief, Ethan had attentive eyes, open ears, and a sensitivity capable of piercing the noise of everyday life to reach what was hidden behind the walls. History has revealed that courage isn't just about grand gestures or fiery words, but also about the quiet strength of those who decide to act when no one else is willing. Ethan didn't face danger with weapons or shouts. He faced it with paper, pen, and a cell phone, recording every detail that proved his truth. He risked himself in secret, knowing that at any moment he could be discovered, ridiculed, or even punished. But he persisted because something inside him screamed that his life needed saving. This narrative isn't just about the salvation of Angela Moore, the woman who for days was kept silent behind a wall. It's above all about what it means to believe voices we tend to dismiss. How many other Ethans are there in the world? How many other children try to share their insights, only to be silenced by adults who consider themselves too wise to listen? The pain of not being taken seriously can be as devastating as the injustice itself, and the courage of a disbelieved child can hold within them the key to preventing tragedies that would otherwise never be revealed. Ultimately, the episode left a deeper impact than simply rescuing a victim. It exposed how prejudice, disbelief, and a rush to ignore what seems like childish nonsense can blind an entire community. It showed that sensitivity is often more powerful than force, and that observing in silence can be the most lethal weapon against darkness. And while the neighborhood commented in shock on what had happened, a profound reflection remained for all who heard the story. How many voices remain trapped behind invisible walls, waiting for someone who has the courage to believe? The silence of that house would never be the same again. Where once there was only a simple room, old walls, a heavy closet in the corner, and nights suffocated by strange sounds that everyone tried to justify with rational explanations, there was now a space charged with meaning, an eternal landmark of courage and sensitivity. That place had become witness to something much greater than a simple rescue. It had become the setting where the strength of a boy, ignored by so many, overcame fear, abandonment, and collective neglect. Ethan Johnson, who for so long had been seen as just another shy, quiet, and overly imaginative child, had unknowingly become the decisive link between quiet despair and freedom. He wasn't seeking recognition. He never wanted applause, but now he would forever carry the symbolic and emotional weight of that intimate and solitary choice. The choice not to turn away, not to silence his voice, not to pretend not to hear what so many ignored. The story of Angela Moore, the woman found alive behind a false wall, was not only the outcome of a terrible crime that shocked the city, it was also the revelation that the truth can live where least expected, hidden in almost imperceptible details, revealed only to those who have the courage to really look, to listen with their heart, to trust their own senses. While neighbors murmured in indignation, while news reports filled the television with shocking phrases and sensational headlines, few could imagine the true transformation that night had wrought in Ethan's life. In the quiet of his room, as he stared at the ceiling, his eyes lost in memories and feelings difficult to name, he understood that there was something within him that could no longer be ignored. His sensitivity, previously treated as weakness, now revealed a strength no one expected. He realized he didn't have to be what others expected. He just had to remain attentive to his feelings and courageous enough to act when necessary. At just 12 years old, Ethan had understood what many adults never learn: that the world doesn't change just with grand speeches or grandiose actions, but with quiet actions that, at the right moment, break the cycle of indifference. And in that moment, looking into the closet that had hidden so much suffering, he knew he would never forget the sound of those whispers, nor what they taught him about responsibility, empathy, and truth. Ethan's story, therefore, ceases to be just a police report or a bizarre case of the week. It becomes a profound, almost uncomfortable reminder of how much we ignore the invisible around us, how much we disbelieve those who don't fit in, how much we prefer the noise of certainty to the uncomfortable silence of intuition. How many voices do we ignore because they seem too weak? How many signals do we miss simply because we weren't willing to listen? If this story touched you, if it sparked reflections you may not have been able to put into words yet, then now is the time to keep it going. Subscribe to the channel now, because we'll continue bringing you stories that need to be heard. Stories of people like Ethan, who transform reality with silent but powerful gestures. Share this video and stay tuned for future episodes, because the next case will expose even darker secrets, hidden in places where innocence seemed untouchable. And remember, the next whisper may not just be a sound in the dark. It may be a cry for help that only you will have the courage to hear.